The first Soviet assault rifle that almost changed everything was the AS-44, designed by Sudayev, firing an intermediate cartridge just wide enough to tear your torso apart. But having a brilliant prototype was not going to be enough, and the Soviet Union needed something that could be mass-produced without the factory falling apart. So they gave it a try. Then came the most influential cartridge that changed warfare forever, the 7.62x39. Wherever it hits you, say goodbye to staying on your feet. Yeah, a doctor sees that wound, the game is over. It was the first of its kind, and it took advantage of the balance between velocity and mass to be more lethal at intermediate distances. Technically, you can think of it as the first true assault cartridge with a massive kinetic energy punch to knock something down at 300 meters. So the 7.62x39 had a bottleneck case with a pronounced shoulder. It is smaller than a full-power rifle cartridge, but larger than a pistol round, equivalent to the midpoint between both worlds today. Then, the gas pushed the gas piston, making the cycle brutally simple to maintain. But not everyone had one yet. And one of the first to use it was the RPD. You load the 100-round belt, feed it into the drum, charge the bolt, and spit fire at a rate that makes World War II light machine guns cry. This basically brought the era of the DP-28 and its direct successors to an end. Although maintenance was still a nightmare, it would have helped if you did not need a second man to carry the ammunition, but it was far more agile. Where the German MG-42 fired at a frantic rate of up to 1,500 rounds per minute from a fixed position, the RPD operated at a more controlled pace of 650 to 750 revolutions per minute and moved with the platoon. The belt-fed cartridges jammed in the cold at first, so Soviet troops still used old Mosin rifles through much of the early campaigns, but the RPD would remain in service into the 1960s. It was the peak of post-war light machine gun design, but the next great leap had to be a capable mass production rifle. The AK-47 Type 1 was that first attempt, a stamped sheet steel receiver, cheaper to manufacture, lighter to carry. The problem was that post-war Soviet stamping technology was a disaster. The tolerances were terrible, the receivers bent under stress, and the parts simply did not hold up. So that single problem is what the next model was designed to fix. So the AK-47 Type 2 was that solution. A receiver milled from a solid block of steel, heavy as an ingot, but as reliable as death. What they came up with was machining it from scratch with broad tolerances, so it would run full of mud, snow, and blood. That became the first truly standardized Kalashnikov. The AKS had taken the Kalashnikov concept as far as the line infantry would allow, and the next change was not going to be the weapon at all. It was going to be the way it was deployed. That change was the wire folding stock invented for Soviet paratroopers, built on the Type 2 milled receiver. The Type 3 refined the design by reducing weight without sacrificing strength, but it came close to being too expensive to produce for an army of millions. So they kept improving it and manufacturing more of these gas-operated rifles, and that became the AKM. What they came up with was returning to the stamped receiver, but this time with improved technology, lighter, cheaper, with a slanted muzzle compensator to control muzzle climb in full auto, and a hammer retarder to prevent premature firing. It also used truly interchangeable parts that would fit any AKM from any factory in the Soviet bloc. So think of something like a Ford-style production line applied to an assault rifle. You could say this was the moment the Kalashnikov became the most produced weapon in history. But it had one problem. Mass production means inconsistent quality control. Variants with small differences can appear, or even parts that do not fit properly if you mix components from different factories. So it worked brilliantly in combat, but it was a logistical puzzle. So they got to work. They made a whole lot of the AKMS, basically the AKM with a metal folding stock. But after the AKMS, things stepped up a level because the Soviet Army expanded its airborne doctrine, and the wire stock technology of the 1960s was flourishing. But they were still too heavy for what the paratroopers needed. So instead of buying something completely new, they took the AKM they already had and stretched it into this thing called the RPK, to basically turn that assault rifle into a light machine gun like this. A longer and heavier barrel, a folding bipod, and a 40 or 75-round magazine. So you set up your position, deploy the bipod, and fire. It started with the standard 7.62 and later accepted the same 75-round drum magazine as the AKM. The days of loading a completely different machine gun with its own unique parts were brought to an end by this thing. For the first time, a platoon could have suppressive fire using the same cartridge as the rest of the squad. But the RPK was still a fixed barrel weapon firing powder and lead until some Soviet engineers saw what the American M16 was doing in Vietnam and sounded the alarm. That produced a doctrinal shift, and almost no tradition survived. And that made the small caliber revolution possible. Meanwhile, the SVD-designated marksman rifle was also fighting shoulder to shoulder with the AKM. And this was about as close as you could get to a semi-auto designated marksman rifle, where platoon marksmen could support the advance without stopping their movement. The SVDS version had a folding stock to make it even more compact for airborne forces. Although it was semi-auto from the beginning, it fired the 7.62 by 54R inherited from the Mosin, the only Soviet round with enough energy to reach 800 meters accurately. Up to this point, no other army had fielded an equivalent semi-auto designated marksman rifle in mass production, but the SVD was simply much lighter and the most practical marksman weapon at the time. However, for missions requiring greater sustained precision, its design, oriented toward reliability and mass production, imposed limits, and the Army began looking for something different for special missions, like the AK-74, which was the first Soviet general-issue small-caliber Kalashnikov, a huge leap forward from the AKM's 7.62. But the AK-74 arrived with enormous confidence because it changed the paradigm in two dimensions that became evident in Afghanistan. First, the 5.45 by 39 had far less recoil, allowing controlled automatic fire, whereas the 7.62 kicked like a jackhammer. Second, the bullet was unstable in soft tissue and caused devastating cavitation wounds, and the Soviet 5.45 inflicted much more severe damage than the 7.62 at intermediate distances. The world had already seen enough. Something had to level the playing field between the M16 and whatever came next. The AKS-74 added the reinforced plastic folding stock for airborne forces, and here the Kalashnikov proved that it could evolve without losing its soul. Well, and that wish became reality with the iconic RPK-74. Load a 45-round 5.45 magazine, and it can send rounds downrange much faster and suppress positions with far less recoil fatigue than the previous caliber. In fact, the RPK-74 almost did not make it because it was competing with keeping the drum magazine inherited from the 7.62 RPK, a magazine intended to maintain volume of fire without frequent reloads. But sure, the Army had fully committed to the 5.45 caliber doctrine, but the Soviet generals did not want to lose projectile mass because that would probably reduce the suppressive effect at long distances with the logistics of everything. So they ordered the design to stick to the new 5.45 standard, fight the war first, and engineering can come later as a luxury problem. And that is the weapon that dominated the valleys of Afghanistan and the conflicts of the Soviet bloc until the end of the Red Era. So, the Soviet Army frantically selected features from both the full-length AK-74 and the urgent need for a compact weapon and turned it into the AKS-74U. The nickname Krinkov did not originate among the Afghans, but among the Americans who encountered the weapon in Afghanistan during the 1980s. Probably from a misunderstanding or an assumed manufacturer's name, the Afghans simply called it the short one. The weapon used the 5.45 round with only an 8-inch barrel to match the portability of submachine guns, making it one of the first modern compact assault carbines of its kind. So that forced a panicked Soviet army to also accept the increased muzzle flash and the uncontrollable blast to level the playing field, finally creating the legendary Special Forces CQB weapon that fought in Afghanistan but did not solve the problem of terminal energy at intermediate distances and was also very hard on the gas system. So if the American came up with something advanced, then the Soviet had to outdo it with volume of fire, right? So, by then, confidence was high, and the Soviets were not going to stop this momentum of special engineering. By the late 1980s, the KGB and Spetsnaz wanted a silent weapon to replace the improvised post-war solutions. The result was the Vintorez and its brother, the AS-Val, about half a kilogram heavier because of the integrated suppressor. They were essentially semi-auto and selective fire platforms with a detachable 20-round magazine fed from below, but they fired the 9x39 SP5 and SP6 because after the first operations in Afghanistan, Soviet special weapons specialists, especially those at TSNI Tokmash, argued that covert operations took place at very short distances. They wanted to adopt a heavy subsonic cartridge like the 9x39 for perfect suppression in full auto. But the Soviets were still obsessed with ammunition compatibility until urban operations in Kabul at distances of 50 meters taught a hard lesson that a standard weapon-firing supersonic bullets was simply not the right tool for the job. It later became the standard weapon of Spetsnaz in Chechnya, but the Val was also the last of the great secret designs of the Soviet era. Then, the next weapon set the standard for the modern special weapons we know today. And even the AK-74M went through multiple iterations, mainly in materials and modularity. The AK-74 had several versions until it settled on the M model. The receiver was reinforced to accept the new Soviet standard side rail for mounting optics, and this model was the one that unified the folding stock, optics rail, and grenade launcher compatibility into a single model. Then came additional rails and accessories with the M, which came from the factory with a folding polymer stock, and now it was possible to mount all kinds of optics and lights. And that change remained even with the following models with the adapted Picatinny rail. But that was not enough. They wanted to reinforce everything. So that introduced stronger magazines, commercial suppressors, better sights, and every small part you can imagine. So, going from the old AKM that looks like this to a modernized AK-74M, which later led to the Abakan program that looks like this. Each one evolved from previous complaints mixed with a few mistakes along the way, such as trying to add a completely new recoil system and then discovering that it was impossible to maintain in the field. The AN-94 was that ambitious gamble, with a sliding barrel mechanism that fired the first 2 rounds at 1,800 rounds per minute before dropping to a normal cyclic rate to maximize the probability of a hit. The Abakan family also made enormous contributions to the science of building a more accurate weapon for elite forces. That laid the groundwork for the debate over whether the AK-74M was enough or whether Russia needed something radically different. And one of the biggest was the PP-19 Bizon's helical magazine design. Russian special forces loved that thing and had adopted it, the version with the 64-round magazine under the barrel, of course, which does not heat up as much during prolonged CQB operations to achieve better suppressive fire indoors. The intention was to replace some obsolete submachine guns, but it ended up replacing part of the Spetsnaz arsenal. The Bizon was developed by Izhmash at the request of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and was formally adopted by some units because it can serve as a replacement for a machine pistol with submachine gun capability because it can do both. The 9A91, for its part, was the compact answer for agents who needed something that could fit under a coat and still penetrate body armor. During this time, everything was about making these rifles more exportable and more capable, with systems like accessory rails and multiple calibers to sell to markets that the Soviet 545 AK-74 could not reach. It would be crazy to bring a modern AK-103 back to the battles of 1944. The difference compared to a soldier armed with a Mosin is enormous in rate of fire, magazine capacity, and tactical versatility. Everything that made a direct comparison with World War II weaponry impossible. All of it was to lay the foundation for the export portfolio we see today. The market put it through hard service, and that quickly exposed what still needed to be fixed in terms of modern accessories. During this time, there were also a lot of programs trying to solve the Kalashnikov's recoil problem. It was a constant dance. Keep improving the AK-74M, or admit that the classic gas-operated principle might not be the platform of the future. But then, they always ended up coming right back to it. We had all these balanced recoil systems being tested, but none of them would officially replace the AK-74M, and some only made it into special operations where the budget and the patience were greater. Until recently, The Russian army is now fielding the AK-12 in small numbers, with a new standard of ergonomics and modularity intended to eventually replace the AK-74M on the front line. It promised to be the first truly modern Kalashnikov, with factory-installed Picatinny rails, an adjustable stock, and improved sights. And it continues to evolve no matter how many negative opinions there are about the slow pace of re-equipment. The 2023 revision of the AK-12 went in the opposite direction from what the tactical community expected. They simplified it. They removed the improved 2-round burst trigger, simplified components, and reduced production costs to speed up deliveries to troops in active combat in Ukraine. So, from the AS-44 prototype to today's AK-12, that is nearly 8 decades that shaped the Soviet and Russian service rifle into what it is today. If you want to dive deeper into these topics, be sure to check out these here.